No one ever imagines that the most dangerous monster could be sitting at the breakfast table, eating toast with butter, calling the same man father that you do. This is a truth I've carried in silence for decades. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Grandma Simone, 73 years old, speaking to you from my little house in Riverside, California. A city many now know for its beautiful Mission Inn, but one that carries stories of so many lives like mine, some submerged not by floods, but by silence. Before diving into my story, I want to thank each of you who took a moment to listen. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And please, tell me in the comments how many brothers or sisters you have. I love learning more about you who follow me from different places across America. Each family story is unique and special and helps me feel that we're all connected in this big family we've formed here on the Grandparents' Tales channel. I was born in 1952, in an era when children were to be seen and not heard, as my mother used to say. Our house was in a working-class neighborhood where factory whistles marked everyone's daily rhythm. It was a small brick house, painted a faded yellow, with a backyard where my mother grew herbs and kept a few scrawny chickens that laid small eggs. Our family was what people called getting by. We didn't go hungry, but money was always tight at the end of the month. My father, Mr. Alcides, worked at a steel mill, leaving home when it was still dark and returning after the sun had already gone. A man of few words, calloused hands, and a permanent weariness etched on his face. My mother, Mrs. Helena, worked as a seamstress in a clothing factory, spending her days hunched over a Singer sewing machine, coming home with back pain and eye strain from focusing on the needlepoint all day. We were 3 siblings. Maristella, the oldest, 4 years ahead of me. Augusto, the middle child, 2 years older than me. And me, the youngest, who learned early on to fend for myself. With our parents always out, Maristella was the one who took care of the house and us. At just 12 years old, she already knew how to cook beans, iron clothes, and scold us when necessary. Maristella was my safe harbor. While Augusto grew increasingly rebellious and aggressive, she was sweetness and protection. "Stay close to me, Moan," she would say, using the nickname only she could call me. "I won't let anyone hurt you." And for many years, she kept that promise. She woke up before everyone else, prepared breakfast, got us ready for school, checked our homework. At night, when I had nightmares, it was in her bed that I took refuge, smelling the ivory soap that always lingered in her hair. Our routine was always the same. Quick breakfast before our parents left for work, school in the morning, lunch prepared by Maristella, usually rice and beans with a fried egg when luck smiled upon us. Household chores in the afternoon, and dinner almost at bedtime, when our parents finally returned, too tired for conversation or affection. On Sundays, the only day we were all together, my mother would wake up early to make a stew with potatoes, or, on special occasions, a roasted chicken that had to last the entire week. My father would sleep in, then sit in the only armchair in the house to listen to baseball games on the radio, a beer in hand and a cigarette in the ashtray. As we grew up, it became clear that Augusto was following a different path. At school, complaints were constant. Fights during recess, rude responses to teachers, homework never done. At home, he talked back to my mother, slammed doors, and had a look that frightened me even when I was too young to understand why. "The boy just needs discipline," my father would say when my mother complained. "Leave it to me. I'll straighten him out." But the occasional slaps and belt whippings that Augusto received only seemed to make him angrier, like a pressure cooker about to explode. With Maristella, he maintained a relationship of silent hatred. She was everything he wasn't: responsible, studious, beloved by teachers and neighbors. "Little Miss Perfect," he would mutter when she tried to make him follow house rules. Sometimes, when adults weren't looking, he would pinch my arm hard until I cried, just to see Maristella run to my defense and then get blamed for not taking proper care of her siblings. As we got older, the situation only worsened. At 15, Augusto was already known in the neighborhood as trouble. He smoked in secret with other boys from the street, skipped school to hang out at the park, and the neighborhood girls began to avoid passing in front of our house. "He keeps saying disgusting things, Mom," the daughter of Mrs. Marlene reported once. He talks about what he wants to do to us. It's disgusting. My mother, always exhausted, would just sigh. It's a phase, it'll pass. Boys are like that when they're becoming men. It's the hormones. But Maristella knew it wasn't just a phase. She saw what the adults, too busy surviving, couldn't or wouldn't see. She saw how Augusto looked at girls on the street as if they were pieces of meat. She saw the obscene gestures he made when he thought no one was watching. And worst of all, she saw how he was beginning to look at me, his own sister, with those same eyes. If he ever touches you, tell me immediately, she told me one day, pulling me into a corner of the kitchen, away from everyone's ears. No matter what he says, no matter if he threatens you, you come straight to me, understand? I was only 11 at the time and didn't fully understand what she meant. But the fear in her eyes was real, and it was etched in my memory as a constant warning. Maristella was my eyes when I couldn't see the danger, my ears when I couldn't hear the threats, my shield when I had no strength to defend myself. She gave up her own dreams to take care of me and the house. She stopped going out with her friends, participating in the church youth group, attending the dances she so enjoyed. All to be always present, always vigilant. One day we'll get out of here, she promised me, on nights when we shared the small bed, our heads together on the same pillow. We'll live just the two of us, in a nice place, with flowers in the window. You'll study, you'll become somebody in life. I'll work to give you everything I never had. I believed her with the blind faith that only children have. I imagined this different life while sweeping the kitchen floor or washing my father's socks in the backyard washtub. A place where we wouldn't need to lock the bathroom door in fear, where we could laugh out loud without being reprimanded, where Augusto and his threatening gaze wouldn't exist. But fate, my dears, has plans that we cannot foresee. And sometimes, when we think things can't get worse, we discover that the bottom of the well has trap doors that lead to even darker places. The year was 1968. I was 16, Maristella 20, and Augusto 18. America was in turmoil with the Vietnam War and civil rights movements, but in our house we lived under another dictatorship, less talked about but equally brutal, that of fear. My parents continued working from dawn to dusk, increasingly bent by the weight of life. Maristella had secured a job at a fabric store downtown, waking up even earlier now, but still taking care of everything and everyone. Augusto had been expelled from school the previous year, after being caught beating up a classmate in the schoolyard. Now he spent his days wandering around the neighborhood, coming home late at night, often smelling of cheap liquor. My father tried to get him a job at the steel mill, but he lasted just 2 weeks before being fired for fighting with a supervisor. "That boy is going to end up in jail," my father would grumble, not knowing that his prophecy would come true sooner than he thought, but not for the reasons he assumed. It was against this backdrop that the worst happened. One March afternoon, Maristella was returning from work when a car ran a red light on Main Street. She didn't stand a chance. She died instantly, along with 3 others who were waiting at the bus stop. The news hit like a punch to the stomach. I remember the police officer standing at our door, hat in hand, speaking words that seemed to come from far away. I remember my mother's scream, a sound that didn't seem human. I remember my father, for the first and only time in his life, falling to his knees on the living room floor, face in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And I remember, with a clarity that haunts me to this day, Augusto's face. There were no tears, no apparent pain, just a distant look, and at the corner of his lips, something that seemed almost like a smile. At that moment, without fully understanding why, I knew that my world hadn't just collapsed. It had been completely devastated, with no chance of reconstruction. The shield that protected me had been shattered forever. And now I was exposed, vulnerable, at the mercy of a danger that lived in my own home. Maristella's funeral was brief. Few neighbors, some colleagues from the store, no elaborate speeches. An entire life of sacrifice and care reduced to a few hours in a simple casket, some wilted flowers, and a hole in the ground at Pine Hill Cemetery. We returned home immersed in a silence as dense as fog. My mother went straight to her room, swallowed a sedative, and didn't come out for 2 days. My father returned to work the following morning. "Life goes on, bills don't wait," he said, his eyes red but dry, his voice choked but firm. And I was left alone in the house with Augusto, the only sound the ticking of the kitchen clock marking the hours until my real nightmare would begin. Because without Maristella to protect me, I was completely defenseless. And Augusto knew this better than anyone. Grief has its own smell, you know. It's a mix of wilted flowers, food made by neighbors that no one eats, and that heavy odor of curtains closed for too long. Our house became impregnated with this smell after Maristella was gone. Just 3 days after the burial, my parents returned to their work routine. Not out of insensitivity, understand, but out of raw necessity. Back then, there was no bereavement leave or psychological counseling. Grief was a luxury that families like ours couldn't afford. Rice, beans, and bills didn't wait for tears to dry. My mother left for the sewing factory before sunrise, her eyes swollen, moving like a ghost through the house. My father, always quiet, had now sunk into an even deeper silence, as if words had died along with his eldest daughter. They left me notes written on scraps of paper on the kitchen table. There's bread in the tin. Heat up yesterday's soup. Lock the door well. What they didn't write, what perhaps they couldn't admit even to themselves, was, be careful of your brother. Augusto changed after Maristella's death. Not suddenly, not like in movies where the villain suddenly shows his true face. It was gradual, like a disease that slowly spreads through the body until it dominates everything. First came the looks, long, fixed, while I washed dishes or swept the floor, taking on the tasks that were once Maristella's. A type of look that made me feel dirty without even knowing why. Then came the accidental bumps in the narrow hallway, hands that lingered too long when passing me something, ambiguous comments that left me confused and disgusted. Turning into quite the woman, aren't you, Simone? He would say, his eyes traveling up and down my body. Maristella isn't here to protect you anymore. Now it's just the two of us when the old folks go out to work. I tried to stay away from him, made up excuses to leave the house, spent hours at the public library, at classmates' houses, even at church, though I was never religious. But I couldn't stay out forever. And night always came, bringing darkness and fear inside those thin wooden walls. On a Tuesday in April, almost a month after losing Maristella, it was raining heavily in Riverside. One of those California rainstorms that seemed to want to wash away the entire city. I couldn't go to school because our neighborhood streets were flooded. My parents had managed to leave for work very early, before the worst of the storm, and I was left alone at home. Or rather, alone with Augusto. I tried to lock myself in the bedroom I used to share with Maristella, but the lock had been broken for months. I sat on the bed, an open book in my lap, eyes fixed on the door, ears alert to every creak of the floorboards. He entered without knocking, around 10 in the morning. He was sober, which was somehow even more frightening than when he came home drunk. "Hey, little sis, what are you afraid of?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe, blocking my only exit. "Leave me alone, Augusto. I'm studying," I replied, trying to sound firm, but my voice betrayed my fear, coming out thin and trembling. He laughed, a sound that had nothing of joy, only malice and something darker, more sinister. "Always the studious one, huh? Just like Maristella, the little saint of the family." He took a step into the room. "But Maristella isn't here anymore, is she? Now it's just you and me." What happened on that rainy morning, my dear viewers, is something I carried in silence for decades. I won't go into sordid details. Some horrors are too heavy even to be put into words. Suffice it to say that on that day at 16, I understood what it means to have your humanity stripped away, to have your body turned into an object, to have your trust in family, this safe harbor that should be sacred, completely shattered. When it was over, he simply got up, adjusted his clothes, and said, in a casual tone that chilled me to the bone, "If you tell anyone, no one will believe you. And if they do believe, I'll say you wanted it. That you're needy since Maristella died. Who do you think they'll believe? Me or the crybaby of the family?" I lay on that bed for hours after he left, unable to move, to cry, to scream. A part of me died on that rainy April morning of 1968. The girl who dreamed of becoming a teacher, who kept magazine clippings of places she wanted to visit, who still believed that life could be good even after the loss of Maristela. That girl was gone forever. In her place remained an empty shell, moving by inertia, breathing because the body insisted on continuing to function even when the soul begs to give up. When my parents arrived at night, soaked from the rain and carrying the weight of another day of work, I couldn't say anything. I looked at them sitting at the kitchen table, silently eating the rice and sausage I had prepared automatically, like a robot programmed to pretend normalcy. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the plates on the floor. I wanted to grab my mother by the shoulders and shake her until she saw the horror that was hiding behind the facade of a working family. But the words wouldn't come. It was as if Augusto had taken my voice along with everything else he took from me. "Is everything okay, sweetie? You're so quiet," my mother asked, her eyes still swollen from crying for Maristela, without energy to really see what was happening under her own roof. "Just tired," I replied, the first of many lies I would tell in the days to come. Days turned into weeks, and the nightmare repeated itself. Not with the same intensity as that first time. It was as if Augusto was testing the limits, seeing how far he could go without raising suspicions. Sometimes it was just words whispered when passing me in the hallway, other times accidental touches that made me cower like a wounded animal. I lost weight. My hair began to fall out. I stopped going to school claiming headaches that weren't entirely lies. My head really did hurt, as did every other part of my being. "Must be missing her sister," the adults would say, attributing my withering to a grief that, while real, was only part of the story. "Time heals all wounds," they repeated, like an empty mantra that meant nothing to someone living a daily hell. In June, almost 3 months after Maristela's death, the unthinkable happened again. My parents had gone out to work, as always. It was a Saturday, but the factory where my mother worked was behind on deliveries, and my father did overtime whenever he could. Augusto came into my room early in the morning. He was drunk, his eyes red, his breath sour with whiskey. I won't describe what happened, but this time it was worse. Much worse. The alcohol had knocked down any barrier that might still exist, any remnant of conscience or limits. When he finished, I was bleeding. Not just emotionally, but literally bleeding. The pain was so intense I could barely breathe. And for the first time since the beginning of that nightmare, I cried. Not silent tears of contained despair, but violent sobs that shook my already so mistreated body. "Shut up," he shouted, slapping my face hard enough to make my ear ring. "Want the neighbors to hear? Want everyone to know what you've been doing?" What I had been doing. As if I had any choice, any part in that horror. "I'm going to tell everything," I said, my voice hoarse, a trickle of blood running from my split lip. "I'm going to tell Mom and Dad what you did." He laughed, that laugh that would haunt me for decades in nightmares. "And you think they'll believe you? The troubled daughter who doesn't leave her room, who dropped out of school, against the son who's looking for work, who helps with the house bills?" It was true that he had started bringing some money home, from occasional jobs as a loader at the market. Small amounts that bought the silence and blindness of my parents. "Besides," he continued, leaning so close I could feel his foul breath, "if you open your mouth, I'll do worse, much worse, and not just to you." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. He didn't need to elaborate. I understood perfectly what he meant. My parents, already destroyed by the loss of one daughter, now too old to start over and too young to give up, would be the next targets of his cruelty. When he left the room, I locked myself in the bathroom. The shower water, even cold in that California winter, couldn't clean me. I scrubbed my skin until it was red, but the feeling of filth remained, ingrained so deep that no soap could reach it. That night, I didn't prepare dinner, didn't leave the room. Lying on the bed I once shared with Maristela, looking at the moisture-stained ceiling, I made a decision. If no one would believe me, if I had nowhere to run, if I couldn't protect even myself, then perhaps the only way out was to no longer be here. My mother's sleeping pills were kept in the dresser drawer next to their bed. They were strong, prescribed by the factory doctor when she could no longer sleep after Maristela's death. I would just have to wait for everyone to fall asleep and take the bottle. It would be quick. It would be easy. It would be the end of the nightmare. With this dark plan in mind, I fell asleep, too exhausted even to cry. I woke up hours later to the sound of the front door opening, my father coming home from work. It was already night. The room was in complete darkness. I got up with difficulty, my aching body protesting every movement. I needed to go to the bathroom. Couldn't wait any longer. I dragged myself down the hallway, trying not to make noise, but a moan of pain escaped when I put weight on my injured leg. It was at that exact moment that Augusto appeared in his bedroom doorway, blocking my path. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his slurred voice indicating he had been drinking more since the morning. "To the bathroom," I replied, eyes fixed on the floor, unable to look at him. "You're not going to tell the old man anything, are you?" "Remember what I said." Before I could answer, he grabbed my arm tightly, his nails digging into my skin. And then he did the unthinkable. He pushed me against the wall and began to attack me right there, in the hallway of our house, with my father just a few feet away in the kitchen. Desperation gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I fought, I struggled, and when his hand covered my mouth to muffle my screams, I bit down with all the strength I had. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth when my teeth broke through the flesh of his palm. Augusto howled in pain and punched me in the stomach, knocking all the air out of my lungs. I fell to my knees, choking, trying to breathe as he raised his fist for another blow. That's when the miracle happened. A terrible, painful miracle, but still a salvation. My father, attracted by the sounds of the fight, appeared in the hallway. For a moment, he stood paralyzed by the scene before him, his eldest son, with his fist raised, blood running from his hand, standing over his youngest daughter fallen on the floor, her face swollen, blood and tears mixed. "What the hell is going on here?" he thundered, his voice louder than I had ever heard from this always restrained man. Augusto turned, surprised, momentarily disoriented by the interruption. It was enough for me to find my voice, for the words trapped for months to finally break through the barrier of fear. "He hurt me, Dad," I managed to say between sobs. "Since Maristela died, he's been hurting me." My father's face changed, not all at once, but gradually, like ice melting to reveal something deeper, more primitive underneath. His eyes, always tired, widened with a horrible understanding. "What do you mean, hurting?" he asked, his voice now low, dangerous. Before I could answer, Augusto intervened, the lie flowing as easily as always. "She's crazy, Dad. She's been making things up since Maristela died. I was just trying to make her stop screaming. She was bothering everyone with her crying." My father looked at him, then at me, the doubt clear on his face. For a terrible moment, I thought he would believe his son, as he always had, that I would be abandoned again to the mercy of that monster we called family. But then, something unexpected happened. My father stepped forward and with a frightening calmness said, "Take off her clothes." Augusto blinked, confused. "What?" "You heard me. If she's lying, then take off her clothes. Show me there's nothing wrong." Panic seized me. "No, Dad, please." But my father raised his hand, asking for silence, his eyes never leaving Augusto's. "If you didn't do anything, son, then there's no problem showing that she's making it up, right? That there are no marks, no injuries." It was at this moment that I saw something I had never seen before on Augusto's face. Fear. Pure and genuine fear. "This is ridiculous," he tried, taking a step back. "I'm not going to stand here listening to accusations from an unstable girl." He turned to leave, but my father was faster. With surprising agility for a man of almost 50, he grabbed Augusto by the collar and pushed him against the wall, his forearm pressing against his throat. "What did you do to her?" he growled, his voice unrecognizable with anger. "What did you do to your sister?" What followed that night was like a storm that finally breaks after months of heavy, suffocating sky. Augusto, pressed against the wall by my father's arm, tried to deny it once more. But there was something in my father's expression, something primitive and uncontrollable, that finally made fear appear in my brother's eyes. "I didn't do anything she didn't want," he tried, his voice strangled by the pressure on his neck. And those words, that final attempt to reverse the situation, to transform me from victim to guilty, were the trigger. My father, who never showed intense emotions, who swallowed frustrations with black coffee and endured daily humiliations at the factory without a word of protest, exploded. The first blow caught Augusto on the chin, the second in the stomach. When my brother fell to his knees, too surprised to react, my father continued, a blind fury taking over him. I watched that scene paralyzed, leaning against the wall, one part of me horrified by the violence, another part, which I'm not proud to admit, feeling a terrible relief at seeing my tormentor finally tasting a bit of the terror he made me feel. It was my mother who interrupted. She arrived from work in the middle of that chaos, dropped her purse on the floor, and screamed like I had never heard her scream, "Stop! For God's sake, stop!" Time seemed to freeze. My father, breathing heavily, took a step back, his hands bloodied. Augusto, on the floor, his face deformed by the blows, spitting blood onto the worn floorboards. And me, still leaning against the wall, hugging my own body as if I could protect myself from the horror of that scene. "What is happening here?" my mother asked, shock giving way to confusion on her exhausted face. My father turned to her, his breathing still irregular, and said 5 words that changed everything. He abused our daughter. The silence that followed was as dense as fog. I saw my mother's face go through 1,000 emotions in seconds: disbelief, horror, denial, and finally a devastating understanding when her eyes fell on me, really seeing me for the first time in months. "Simone," she called, her voice almost a whisper. "Is it true?" I couldn't answer with words. I just nodded, tears flowing freely down my face marked by Augusto's blows. And then, as if that small movement had broken a dam, the words came in a torrent. I told everything, right there, in the narrow hallway of our house, while Augusto remained fallen on the floor and my parents listened, horrified. I omitted nothing. I spoke of the first time, right after Maristella's death, of the threats, the constant fear, the pains, the bleeding that morning. I spoke until my voice failed, until there was nothing more to say except a final whisper. I wanted to die. My mother took a step toward me, arms outstretched, but stopped, uncertain. How to console the inconsolable? How to repair the irreparable? Her face, already marked by the grief of one daughter, now contorted with the pain of knowing she had failed to protect the other. "Why didn't you tell us before?" she asked, her voice breaking. "He said you wouldn't believe me," I replied, eyes downcast. "And I also thought you wouldn't." Those words hit my parents like a physical blow. The painful truth behind them, that I didn't trust them enough to seek protection, that the distance that years of hard work and absence had created was too great to bridge even in the face of the worst horrors. It was my father who made the decision. With a frightening calmness that contrasted with the fury of minutes before, he turned to my mother and said, "Take Simone to the hospital, now." "And him?" my mother asked, looking at Augusto, who was now trying to get up, leaning against the wall. "I'll take care of him," my father replied, and there was something in his voice that left no doubt about what that meant. My mother hesitated only a second before nodding. She approached me carefully, as if I were a wounded animal that might flee at any sudden movement. "Come, sweetheart, let's take care of you." Riverside Community Hospital was almost an hour's bus ride from our house, but that night we took a taxi, an unthinkable luxury for our family, paid for with money my mother kept hidden in a coffee can for emergencies. And what emergency could be greater than this? The emergency room was crowded, as always. People with fevers, cuts, broken bones, all waiting for care with the resignation typical of the poor who know their time is worth less than others. But when my mother explained in whispers to the nurse what had happened, we were immediately taken to a room in the back. The doctor who attended me was young, perhaps recently graduated, with kind eyes and careful hands. She examined me with a gentleness that brought tears back. Not of pain, but of relief at being treated as something fragile and valuable after so long being just an object. "She'll need to be admitted," the doctor told my mother after the examination. "There are internal lacerations that need to be treated, possible infection, dehydration, malnutrition." The accusatory look wasn't spoken, but it was there, implicit. "How did you not see this happening? How did you allow your daughter to reach this state?" My mother just nodded, shoulders bent under the weight of guilt she would carry for the rest of her life. I was admitted that same night. A shared room, divided with 3 other women, all older than me, all with their own stories of pain they didn't share, but which I recognized in the looks we exchanged. My mother stayed by my side, sitting in an uncomfortable chair, holding my hand while I received IV fluids and antibiotics. We didn't talk much. What was there to say now was said, and words seemed small, inadequate in the face of the abyss that opened between the before and after of that night. At some point I fell asleep, too exhausted to stay awake, my body finally surrendering to the weight of the last few months. When I woke up hours later, my mother was still there, her red eyes showing she hadn't slept, her face marked by an aging that seemed to have happened overnight. "Where's Dad?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She hesitated, looking around as if afraid someone might hear, before answering. "He went to the police station. He took Augusto." A wave of panic swept over me. "He told? To the police?" My mother nodded slowly. "Your father said this time he wasn't going to let it slide, that he had already lost one daughter and wasn't going to lose another." Fear dominated me again. Not of Augusto now, but of what would come next. Of the public shame, the looks, the whispers of neighbors, the stigma I would carry forever. In 1968, in America, a girl who went through this wasn't seen as a victim, but as tainted, damaged, a shameful secret to be hidden. "Everyone will know," I murmured, the tears returning. "Everyone will look at me differently." "Let them look," my mother replied, an unusual hardness in her soft voice. "Those who feel shame should be the ones hiding, not you." Those were surprising words coming from her, always so concerned with appearances, always so attentive to what others would think. At that moment, I glimpsed a strength I didn't know she possessed, a maternal fury that had remained dormant for too long. I spent a week in the hospital. The doctors spoke in technical terms about my conditions, words I didn't fully understand, but whose meaning I grasped from the tone of their voices, from the looks exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Meanwhile, a hurricane was forming outside. My father filed a formal complaint against Augusto, who was initially detained and then transferred to the juvenile detention center. He was still 18, technically a minor by the standards of the time. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire in dry straw. The neighbors, previously indifferent to our family drama, now openly discussed the case. Some were supportive, others doubtful. She must have provoked him. These girls nowadays. In my day, this didn't happen. The worst came when a detective appeared at the hospital to take my statement. A middle-aged man, thick mustache, smelling of cigarettes and cheap aftershave. His questions were direct, brutal, without any sensitivity toward a traumatized teenager. "Did you resist? Did you scream for help? Had you been drinking anything? What were you wearing?" Each question was a new stab, insinuating that somehow I had a part in that horror, that I could have avoided it if I had done something different. My mother, sitting beside me, became increasingly tense until she finally exploded. "Enough! She is the victim here. She was 16 years old and he is her brother." The detective looked at her with that condescension that men in authority reserve for emotional women and replied, "Ma'am, I'm just following protocol. We need to verify all angles before proceeding with such serious accusations." Serious accusations. As if I were making it all up, as if the cuts and bruises on my body were imagination, as if the tears that wouldn't stop falling were a trick to get attention. It was at that moment, under the doubtful gaze of that man who should be protecting me, that I made a decision. I wouldn't let Augusto escape. I wouldn't allow that story to be hushed up, forgotten, transformed into just another family secret to be buried along with so many others. I sat more upright in the hospital bed, ignoring the pain the movement caused, and began to speak, with details, with precision, with a clarity that surprised even myself. I described each incident, each threat, each humiliation. I spoke without crying, without hesitating, looking directly into the eyes of that man who clearly would rather be anywhere else. When I finished, the room was plunged into sepulchral silence. The detective, visibly uncomfortable, put away his notebook and stood up. "Well, I think we have enough for now," he said, avoiding my gaze. "We'll be in touch if we need more information." After he left, my mother held my hand tightly. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice breaking. "Prouder than I've ever been of anyone in this life." Those were words I kept as a treasure in the difficult years that would follow, a beacon in the darkness when everything else seemed lost. On the 10th day after that fateful night, I was discharged from the hospital. I returned home leaning on my mother's arm, my body still aching, my soul even more so. The house seemed different, smaller, darker, or perhaps it was me who had changed, grown in ways no teenager should grow. Augusto wasn't there, of course. He had been transferred to a juvenile detention center while the case was being investigated. My father spent more time at home now, had reduced his overtime hours, was always around, as if trying to compensate for years of absence with a constant presence that sometimes suffocated. The room I shared with Maristela was now just mine, but the ghosts of her and of what happened there remained. In the first few nights, I couldn't sleep in that bed. I set up an improvised mattress in the living room and stayed there, under the worried gaze of my parents, who didn't insist, understanding without my having to explain. School was another problem. Everyone knew, or thought they knew. The looks, the whispers when I passed by. Even some teachers who treated me with an uncomfortable mixture of pity and suspicion. I endured 2 weeks before giving up completely. I didn't have the strength to face that, not yet. At home, silence reigned. We tried to establish a new routine, to pretend normalcy where normalcy couldn't exist. My parents walked on eggshells around me, measuring words, avoiding any mention of what had happened or what would come next. The court case dragged on. Being a minor, Augusto received different treatment. There were preliminary hearings, expert testimonies, psychological evaluations. Each step was a new torture, forcing me to relive the trauma, to face looks of doubt, to hear technical terms that tried to categorize something that went beyond any category. The worst moment was when I had to face him in a courtroom. He looked different, thinner, in the institution uniform, eyes downcast. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Until he raised his gaze and our eyes met. There was no remorse there, only cold, calculating anger. The same anger I had seen so many times before, now just better contained. The judge, an elderly man with a paternal air, asked questions that echoed those of the detective, just in a softer tone. I answered mechanically, as if talking about another person, another life. When it was over, he looked at me with what seemed to be genuine compassion and said something I carry with me to this day. What happened to you does not define who you are. Remember that on the difficult days. Simple words, perhaps even cliché, but they planted a seed that would take years to bloom. The idea that I wasn't just a victim, that there was more to me than the pain I carried. Augusto was found guilty, but being a minor, he received a sentence that today seems absurdly light to me. Confinement in a correctional institution until he turned 21, with mandatory psychological counseling. 3 years for destroying a life. 3 years for crimes that, if committed today, would result in decades in prison. When we left the courthouse that gray October day of 1968, a reporter from a local newspaper tried to approach me. My father pushed her away with a brusque gesture, protecting me from the flashes and invasive questions. But I heard enough to understand that, for the world out there, I was just another sad case, another statistic, another story to sell newspapers and then be forgotten. Except that I wouldn't be forgotten, and I wouldn't forget either. The path that opened before me was long and winding, full of obstacles I couldn't even imagine. But at that moment, exhausted and still broken, I made a silent promise to myself. I would survive. I wouldn't just exist, dragging myself through the days like a ghost of who I was, but I would live fully, intensely, despite everything and everyone. It was an ambitious promise for a 16-year-old girl who could barely look at her own reflection in the mirror without crying. But it was this promise, this small fire of determination, that kept me breathing in the dark years to come. There is a Japanese technique called kintsugi, where broken ceramic pieces are repaired with gold, making the scars part of the beauty of the object. For a long time, I thought this was impossible for people, that once broken, the human soul would always have ugly and visible cracks. I learned, over time, that I was wrong. The months that followed the trial were a silent nightmare. Our house, previously just a place of passage for people too busy trying to survive, was now a prison of memories. Every corner, every hallway, every shadow seemed to hold an echo of what had happened there. My parents tried to compensate for years of absence with a suffocating presence. My mother quit her job at the sewing factory, finding work as a housekeeper to have more flexible hours and be home when I was. My father reduced his overtime, came home earlier, spent Sundays trying to fix things that didn't need fixing, as if he could repair our broken family with hammer and nails. The winter of 1969 was particularly harsh in Riverside. The Santa Ana winds cut like a razor. The cold rain turned the dirt roads into impassable mud pits. Or perhaps it just seemed colder because I was frozen inside, unable to feel any warmth, any comfort. I completely stopped going to school. The looks, the whispers in the hallways, the anonymous notes left on my desk, slut, liar, destroyed her family, were more than I could bear. The teachers tried to intervene, but how to face something so insidious, so rooted in a culture that punished victims instead of aggressors? For months, I barely left my room. I read the same books repeatedly, drew meaningless patterns in old notebooks, listened to the radio at low volume so as not to bother anyone. My mother brought meals to my bed as if I were sick, and in a way I was. A sickness of the soul that no medicine could cure. The turning point came on an unexpected day, in a way I could never have predicted. It was March 1970, almost 2 years after that April, that destroyed my life. I had just turned 18, a coming of age that passed without celebration, just another day in the calendar of an existence in suspension. I was sitting on the back porch staring at nothing when I heard a weak meow coming from the neighbor's fence. There, skinny and soaked from the rain that had fallen the night before, was a black cat, too small to be an adult, too big to be a kitten, one eye closed by some infection, tangled fur, ribs visible under the skin, a creature as broken as I was. Without thinking much, I extended my hand. He initially retreated, suspicious, also like me. But hunger or cold were stronger than fear, and after a few minutes of motionless patience on my part, he approached, cautiously sniffing my fingers before allowing a brief touch. I fetched some leftover food from the kitchen, put water in a saucer. I observed from a distance as he devoured everything with the voracity of the truly desperate. When he finished, he looked at me with that one good eye, and something in that look hit me deeply. The recognition of one survivor to another. "You can stay, you know," I said, my voice hoarse from little use. "No one will hurt you here." I didn't expect him to understand, of course. They were words more for myself than for him. An affirmation, a promise, perhaps even a prayer. I called him Shadow. Nothing original, I know, but at that time originality wasn't my priority. Survival was. And in some inexplicable way, caring for that mistreated cat gave me a purpose I hadn't had in a long time. My parents, initially reluctant, another mouth to feed, my father grumbled, soon noticed the subtle change in me. I began to get up earlier to feed him. I went out to the pharmacy to buy medicine for his infected eye. I improvised a bed with cardboard boxes and scraps of old blankets. Small gestures, minimal actions that for someone else would be trivial, but for me represented mountains climbed, battles won against the paralyzing fear that had become my only companion. Shadow improved gradually. The infected eye never fully opened, leaving him with a permanently suspicious appearance, as if winking at a world that didn't deserve complete trust. His fur grew shiny. The ribs disappeared under a healthy layer of flesh. In a few months, he transformed into a beautiful cat, though still marked by visible and invisible scars, a bit like I was beginning to do, albeit in a much slower and more painful way. In the second half of 1970, I made a decision that surprised my parents. I would return to studying. Not at the same school, the memories were too heavy, the looks too sharp, but in a night school program on the other side of town. "Are you sure, honey?" my mother asked, worry and hope mixed in her voice. "You don't need to rush." "I am, Mom," I replied, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I can't stay still forever. The first day was a test of courage, like few others. Taking the bus alone, walking 3 blocks to the school building, sitting in a room full of strangers, each step was a small victory against the fear that still lived in me. a dormant animal that could wake at any moment. The class was diverse, older adults who never had a chance to study, young workers trying to improve their lives, some girls like me who, for various reasons, had interrupted their studies. No one asked why I was there. No one looked at me with that mixture of pity and morbid curiosity that had driven me out of my previous school. We were all just people trying to recover something lost. The English teacher, Mrs. Clelia, was the first to notice something in me beyond the quiet girl sitting at the back of the room. After reading an essay I wrote about hope, she called me after class. "You write very well, Simone," she said, her thick glasses magnifying kind eyes. "You have a gift with words." I blushed, unaccustomed to compliments, suspicious of any special attention. "Thank you," I murmured, eyes fixed on the floor. "We're organizing a student newspaper," she continued. "Just a mimeographed sheet, nothing very sophisticated. I'd like you to write something for the first edition." My instinct was to refuse immediately. Expose my thoughts, my words for others to read and judge? The idea was terrifying. But something in her expression, a confidence I hadn't seen directed at me in so long, made me hesitate. "Can I think about it?" I finally asked. "Of course," she smiled. "But don't think too much. Sometimes the best words are the ones that come straight from the heart, without too many filters." I spent the entire week drafting and tearing up papers, starting and restarting, trying to find words that wouldn't reveal too much, but that also wouldn't be empty. On the eve of the deadline, sitting on the back porch with Shadow in my lap, I had an epiphany. I didn't need to tell my specific story to talk about pain, about overcoming, about new beginnings. I wrote a text called Scars, talking about how the wounds we carry can transform into marks of resistance, into silent witnesses of our capacity to continue. I didn't mention abuse, didn't talk about specific traumas. I used metaphors, spoke of trees that survive storms, of houses rebuilt after fires, of bones that break and consolidate stronger at the fracture. When I handed it to Mrs. Clelia, I was trembling. Part of me expected rejection. Another part feared acceptance. Both equally frightening. 2 weeks later, my text was there, occupying almost half of the mimeographed sheet in purple ink that smelled of alcohol. My name underneath, small but legible, Simone Alves. The first time my name appeared on something positive, something created instead of destroyed. Classmates commented, some teachers congratulated me. A woman of almost 60, who attended the night school to fulfill the delayed dream of being literate, asked me to read the text aloud to her as she still struggled with written words. When I finished, I saw tears in her tired eyes. "Child," she said, holding my hands between hers, calloused by decades of domestic work. "You said what many people feel but don't know how to say." That moment, so simple, so unpretentious, planted a seed that would take years to fully bloom, but that began to germinate right there. The idea that my words could touch other people, that my pain, transformed into art, could find an echo in unknown hearts. The student newspaper became a monthly project. I became a regular contributor, then editor, finally the soul of the small periodical that circulated not only in our school, but in other adult education centers around the city. Writing became my refuge, my therapy, my way of processing everything that had happened and continued to happen inside and outside of me. In 1972, I graduated from night school. The ceremony was modest: a borrowed auditorium, certificates printed on simple paper, a cake shared afterward. My parents were there, proud but still carrying that shadow of guilt that would never completely abandon them. Shadow waited at home, probably sleeping on my bed, as he always did when I went out. At 20, I found myself facing possibilities that previously seemed unthinkable. The United States was experiencing the social changes of the early 70s, a time of upheaval that didn't reach the lower classes much, but that at least created an illusion of progress, of opportunities. I got a job as a receptionist at a small publishing house that published textbooks. The salary was minimal, the conditions far from ideal, but being surrounded by books, by words, by people who lived by creating and editing texts was like finding a tribe I didn't know existed. In my free time, I continued writing. Poems, short stories, reflections, most kept in notebooks that only I read, Some shared with Mrs. Clelia, who had become a mentor and friend. It was she who encouraged me to try publishing in small neighborhood newspapers, in amateur magazines, in collections of new authors. "Your voice needs to be heard," she would say, "not just for yourself, but for all those who cannot or are unable to speak." I had my first text published in a real newspaper in 1973, a chronicle about life in the suburbs of Riverside, the small joys and sorrows of daily life, the silent resistance of women who carried entire families on their backs. I received $50 for that text, a ridiculous amount even for the time, but it represented something much greater: recognition, validation, the feeling that my voice mattered beyond the small circle that knew me. It was during this time that I made another important decision: to seek therapy. It wasn't common at the time, especially in lower-class families like mine. Psychologists were seen as a luxury for the rich, or something for crazy people in asylums. But something inside me knew I needed professional help to process the trauma I still carried, that still manifested in nightmares, in startles when someone approached from behind, in relationships I couldn't even imagine having. I found a psychologist who charged affordable prices at a community center maintained by a progressive church. Mrs. Marta, a middle-aged woman with a soft voice and eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. In the first sessions, I could barely speak. I would sit in the chair, look at my hands, mumble monosyllabic answers to her gentle questions. "Take your time," she would say. "We're building trust, and that takes time." Gradually, the words began to come. First in hesitant droplets, then in small flows, eventually in torrents that left me exhausted but strangely light, as if each session removed a small weight from my bent shoulders. "What happened to you was terrible," she told me in a particularly difficult session, when I finally managed to detail the abuses without completely falling apart. "But it's not who you are. It's something that happened to you, not something that defines you." Simple words, almost therapeutic cliches, but they resonated deeply. The idea that I was more than my trauma, that my identity didn't need to be built exclusively around that pain, was revolutionary for a young woman who for years had seen herself only as the girl abused by her brother. The process wasn't linear, nor quick, nor easy. There were days when I seemed to regress completely, days when fear and anger dominated me again, days when I questioned if it was worth continuing to fight. Shadow, now an adult cat with a wise look, seemed to sense these moments. On these days, he wouldn't leave my side, his constant purring like an anchor, keeping me tied to reality when everything else seemed to dissolve. In 1974, my father had a heart attack. It wasn't fatal, but it served as a warning that the years of exhausting work at the steel mill, the weight of guilt, the constant stress had taken their toll. He was forced to retire due to disability, with a minimum pension that barely covered the medications he now needed to take daily. I took on more financial responsibility at home. I got a second job as a freelance proofreader for the same publishing house where I worked, spending nights hunched over proofs of textbooks, hunting for grammar errors and inconsistencies. The extra money helped, but the exhaustion was immense. Still, I continued writing my own texts, publishing occasionally, slowly building a small reputation in the city's literary circles. It was through these circles that I met people who expanded my horizons, who introduced me to ideas and possibilities I had never considered. Young university students, teachers, journalists, artists, people who, in another life, would never have crossed my path. Some became friends, others just passing acquaintances, but all left some mark, some contribution to the person I was becoming. Amid these new contacts, a question began to arise with increasing frequency. Why don't you try college? The idea seemed absurd initially. University was for the rich, for children of doctors and lawyers, not for a girl from a working-class neighborhood who graduated from night school. But the seed was planted, and like all well-nourished seeds, it began to grow. In 1975, at 23, I took the entrance exam for English literature at UC Riverside. I studied like never before, using borrowed materials, frequenting the public library, taking advantage of every free minute between my two jobs. When the list of those accepted came out, my name was there. Not among the first, but there. Enrollment was another challenge. Fees, documents, bureaucracy designed to make access difficult for people like me. But I had secured a partial scholarship, and with the help of my parents, who insisted on contributing despite financial difficulties, I managed to officially become a university student. The UC Riverside campus was a completely new world. In the first few days, I felt like an imposter, waiting for someone to notice that I didn't belong there, that I was just an intruder trying to occupy a space that wasn't rightfully mine. The colleagues, mostly middle class, had stories so different from mine, concerns so distant from the reality I knew. But gradually, as had happened in night school, I found my place, not among the popular groups, not among the circles that formed during breaks to discuss parties and dating, but in the quiet corners of the library, in the more serious discussions about literature and language, in the spaces where ideas mattered more than appearances or origins. The university opened doors I didn't know existed. Professors who recognized potential in my texts, colleagues who respected my opinions in class discussions, opportunities for tutoring and research that complemented the always tight income. And it was there, in a hallway of the English department, that I first saw the poster that would once again change the course of my life. Support Group for Women. Victims of Violence seeks volunteers. No experience necessary, only commitment and empathy. I tore off the contact phone number and put it in my pocket, my heart racing with a certainty I rarely felt. Here was a purpose that made sense, a way to transform my pain into something useful, something that could help other women who were going through what I went through. The path that opened before me wouldn't be easy. There were still mountains to climb, deep valleys to cross. Augusto would eventually leave the institution where he was detained, the ghost of my past always lurking. There would still be moments of doubt, of fear, of regression, but at that moment, standing in the university hallway with a simple piece of paper in my hand, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Not the naive hope of the girl I once was, who believed in happy endings and perfect worlds, but a mature, realistic hope, grounded in the certainty that even the most shattered pieces can be rebuilt into something new, something different, something that carries the marks of the past but isn't defined only by them. Have you ever noticed how certain plants manage to sprout in the cracks of concrete? Those stubborn flowers that find light, even in the most unlikely places? I've always identified with them, because life, my dears, may try to bury us. But if we are seeds, we'll transform this into an opportunity to grow. My first meeting at the support group for women victims of violence happened on a rainy June night in 1976. The location was simple: a borrowed room at the back of a church in downtown Riverside, chairs arranged in a circle, weak coffee served in chipped mugs. I sat in the back, almost hidden, watching the other women arrive. They were of all ages, all social classes, all colors, united only by the shared experience of violence. The group coordinator, Dr. Helena, was a psychologist in her 50s, short gray hair, lively eyes behind heavy-framed glasses. When it was my turn to speak, the words came out choppy, hesitant. I didn't go into sordid details. It wasn't necessary. Those women understood the unsaid, the silences between phrases, the pauses loaded with meanings that words couldn't express. I'm here because I want to help other women, I concluded, my hands trembling despite the effort to keep them steady. Because I want my pain to serve for something beyond destroying me, Doctor. Helena smiled, not with pity, not with condescension, but with recognition. That's how it works, she said. We transform poison into medicine, for ourselves and for others. I started as an administrative support volunteer, answering phones, organizing materials, making coffee. Simple tasks that didn't require directly confronting my own traumas, still in the healing process. But gradually, as my confidence grew, I took on more responsibilities. I helped receive women who arrived for the first time, often as frightened and distrustful as I had once been. I participated in meetings, sharing my experience when it could help someone else feel less alone in their pain. In 1977, while in my third year of English literature, I was invited to participate in a pioneering project of the group, the creation of a small monthly publication with survivor stories, information on legal rights, and available resources. Voices That Matter we called it. A folded sheet, printed on a mimeograph, distributed for free at health clinics, night schools, beauty salons in peripheral neighborhoods, places where women could access it without raising suspicions from abusive husbands or family members. I was designated as editor, using the skills I was developing in college and at work in the publishing house. Each edition was a battle against limited resources, against the still present silence that surrounded domestic and sexual violence. But it was also a victory, an affirmation that our stories deserve to be told, that our voices deserve to be heard. It was through this work that I met Laura, a young, newly graduated lawyer who offered voluntary legal advice to the group. Tall, with impeccable posture, with a fierce conviction that showed in every word she said. She became not just a colleague, but a friend, the first true friendship I built since the events that destroyed my adolescence. "What we're doing here is important," she told me one night, as we worked late finishing a special edition on violence against children. "But it's just a beginning. We need to change the laws, change the institutions, change the culture that allows this to continue happening." Her passion was contagious. Under her influence, I began to see my work in the group not just as emotional support for survivors, but as part of a larger struggle, a movement for social transformation. It was 1978, and America was beginning to engage more openly with issues of domestic violence and sexual abuse. New spaces were opening for discussions previously impossible. It was in this context that we organized the first public seminar on domestic and sexual violence in Riverside. A modest event in a borrowed auditorium at the university. Volunteer speakers, informational material printed with money raised from raffles and bazaars. We expected perhaps 30, 40 people. More than 200 showed up. Among them, sitting discreetly in one of the last rows, was my father. I hadn't invited him, knowing how any mention of my past still made him withdraw into silent guilt. But there he was, aged beyond his years, listening attentively to every word. When I finished my talk, a presentation on how literature could be a tool for awareness and healing for survivors, he waited for everyone to disperse for the coffee break and approached, hesitant like an insecure boy. "I'm proud of you, daughter," he said simply, his voice breaking, before turning and leaving hurriedly, as if afraid he wouldn't be able to contain his emotion. Those were the last words I heard from him. 3 months later, a second heart attack, a fatal one this time, took him while he slept. I found among his belongings an envelope with my name, containing all the newspaper clippings with texts I had published, all copies of Voices That Matter, even college papers I didn't know he had kept. A silent treasure of a man who never knew how to express in life the love he carried. His funeral was simple, as his life had been. My mother, already bent by decades of hard work and accumulated sorrows, seemed to have diminished in size. "Now it's just the two of us," she said, as we returned from the cemetery. It wasn't a complaint, nor a lament, just the observation of a fact that carried the weight of everything our family had been and ceased to be. I graduated in English literature at the end of 1979, the first person in the family to have a university degree. The graduation ceremony was beyond our financial means, so we celebrated at home. A simple cake, a bottle of cheap wine, the presence of some friends from the support group. My mother, sitting at the head of the table with Shadow in her lap, now an elderly cat with slow movements but still attentive eyes, seemed finally at peace. "Your sister would be proud," she said when everyone had gone and we were washing the dishes. It was the first time in years she had directly mentioned Maristela. She always said you would go far. The 1980s brought accelerated changes. America was transitioning through the Reagan era, social movements were gaining strength, new possibilities were opening up. With my degree, I secured a position as a teacher in a community college prep course, giving classes in composition and literature to young people from the periphery who, like me, dreamed of university as a path to a different life. The salary was still modest, but combined with freelance proofreading work and some texts I managed to publish in newspapers and magazines, it allowed for a dignified life. In 1983, I rented a small apartment for myself and my mother, finally leaving the house that carried so many painful memories. A simple place in the downtown area, with 2 tiny bedrooms, a living room that barely accommodated a sofa and a table, but that had large windows that let in the morning sun, and a balcony where I planted red geraniums. Our support group grew, becoming an officially registered non-governmental organization. Women's House, it was called now, occupying its own headquarters, purchased with donations and tireless volunteer work. In addition to support groups, we offered legal assistance, temporary shelter for emergency cases, vocational courses for women seeking financial independence. I took over the coordination of the educational sector, developing materials and programs for schools, businesses, communities, lectures, workshops, booklets, any possible means to bring information about rights, about signs of abusive relationships, about ways to get out of situations of violence. It was in this work that I reconnected with Carlos, a sociology professor I had known superficially at the university. He had specialized in studies on urban violence and was developing a project on how domestic violence connected with other forms of social violence. We started collaborating professionally. Friendship came naturally afterward. Carlos was different from any man I had met. Respectful without being condescending, gentle without being invasive, intelligent without being arrogant. Our work lunches transformed into dinners that no longer had anything to do with projects, into long walks through Fairmount Park on Sunday afternoons, into conversations that extended deep into the night. At 34, I thought romantic relationships weren't part of my destiny. The scars of the past, the ingrained fear, the instinctive distrust, all this seemed an insurmountable barrier between me and any possibility of intimacy. And I was okay with that. I had made peace with this reality, built a meaningful life even without this dimension that for many was essential. But Carlos wasn't in a hurry. He had no expectations. He was simply there, constant as the seasons, respecting my boundaries without questioning them, accepting what I could offer without demanding more. "We're friends," he would say when someone asked about our relationship. "We're companions on the journey," and we were. For almost 2 years, this friendship was enough. It was all we could name. Until the night when, sitting on my small balcony watching a summer storm washing over Riverside, his hand found mine in the dark. I didn't pull back. I didn't freeze. I didn't feel the familiar panic rising in my throat. I just let our fingers intertwine, a simple moment that for me represented a monumental victory over the past. Our relationship progressed at a pace I could sustain. Slow, cautious, with occasional retreats when old memories resurfaced without warning. Carlos understood without my having to explain, respected without making it a sacrifice. With him, I learned that intimacy didn't have to be terrifying, that vulnerability could be strength instead of weakness. In 1985, when the Decade of Women declared by the UN was coming to an end, I was invited to participate in an international congress in New York on women's rights. It was the biggest professional opportunity I had ever received, to present our work at the Women's House to specialists from various countries, to exchange experiences, to build support networks that transcended borders. It was a decisive moment. Seeing hundreds of women and some allied men from different cultures, different backgrounds, united by the same cause that had become my life, was deeply transformative. I realized we weren't alone, that we were part of a much larger current flowing through continents and generations. I returned to Riverside energized, full of new ideas and possibilities. We expanded our programs, established partnerships with international organizations, secured funding for more ambitious projects. The Women's House became a national reference, a model that inspired similar initiatives in other cities. My mother passed away in 1990, peacefully in her sleep, like my father years before. She was 67, but looked much older. A life of hard work and deep pain had left indelible marks. Her last year was peaceful, at least. Retired, she spent her days tending to plants on the balcony, doing small sewing jobs for neighbors, watching her favorite soap operas. On weekends, Carlos would come to dinner, always bringing some dessert she loved. "He's a good man," she told me once when we were alone. "Don't be afraid to be happy, daughter." Just like that, her blessing for something she perceived even when we two were still groping in the dark, trying to define what we had built together. After her death, I sold the apartment we shared and bought a smaller one, closer to the Women's House. Carlos and I started living together. Not officially at first, just him spending more and more nights there, until one day I realized his clothes occupied half the closet and his books dominated the living room shelf. In 1995, at 43, we made our union official. It wasn't a traditional wedding. Neither of us was a person of church or big parties. Just a simple civil ceremony, followed by a lunch with close friends at the neighborhood steakhouse. I didn't wear a white dress or a bouquet or any other symbol that for me still carried the weight of patriarchal expectations I had spent my life fighting. "It's not a happy ending," I told Carlos on the night after the ceremony, lying in our bed, watching the moonlight coming through the window. "It's just a happy chapter in a story that remains complicated, difficult at times." He understood, as he always did. "Life isn't a fairy tale," he replied, holding my hand. "It's more interesting this way." The years that followed brought new challenges, new struggles, new achievements. I continued my work at the Women's House, now as executive director. I published a book, Voices of Silence, Stories of Survival and Resistance, a collection of stories of women who had passed through our organization, with names and details altered to protect their identities. The first edition, modest, sold out in weeks. The second, larger, met the same fate. For the third, a national publisher took over distribution, taking these stories, including a fictionalized version of my own, across the country. The royalties were fully donated to the Women's House, financing the expansion of our services. We didn't have children, Carlos and I. A deliberate choice on my part, accepted by him without questions. The physical scars left by the abuse had made pregnancy a risk I wasn't willing to take, and the emotional scars made the idea of motherhood seem too heavy a weight to carry. But we had children in other ways. The young people who went through our educational workshops, the women who rebuilt their lives with our support, the students I mentored when I eventually became a part-time university professor. Lives touched, stories influenced, futures transformed by work that had been born from my own pain. In 2003, I received news that I had feared for decades. Augusto was back in Riverside. He had spent the years since his release from the juvenile detention center going in and out of prisons for various crimes, assaults, petty thefts, drug trafficking on a smaller scale. Now, at 53, he was back in the city where it all began. The initial fear was overwhelming, like a tsunami devastating decades of therapeutic progress. For weeks, I went back to having nightmares, to obsessively checking locks, to avoiding going out alone after nightfall. Carlos, patient as always, respected this temporary regression without minimizing it, without trying to fix me. It was my current therapist, the third since Mrs. Marta, now that I could afford regular sessions, who helped me process this return to old fear. "You are no longer that defenseless girl," she reminded me. "You have resources, you have support, you have strength, and most importantly, you have choice." Choice. The word resonated deeply. I realized I was letting Augusto control my life again, even at a distance, even without direct contact. I was allowing fear to diminish me, to imprison me, exactly as had happened decades before. No more, I finally decided. I wouldn't confront Augusto directly. There was no need, no benefit in that. But I also wouldn't live hostage to the fear of him. I returned to my routine, to my work, to my life. If our paths crossed one day, I would face that when it happened. Meanwhile, each day lived fully, each woman helped, each word written was a victory over the past. Augusto died in 2007, a victim of liver cirrhosis after decades of alcoholism. I found out through a tiny obituary in the local newspaper, easily ignorable if I didn't have the habit of reading those pages, precisely fearing, hoping for this news. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't feel the need to see one last time the face that for so long had inhabited my nightmares. Instead, I made an anonymous donation to a rehabilitation program for chemical dependence that worked with aggressors trying to break the cycle of violence. It wasn't forgiveness. I never reached that point, and I don't blame myself for that. It was recognition that the story wasn't just about him and me, but about larger systems, intergenerational cycles of trauma and violence that needed to be interrupted. The years continued passing. In 2010, at 58, I retired from the executive directorship of the Women's House, assuming a consultative role that allowed me to continue contributing without the daily administrative strain. I continued teaching at the university, now a course specifically about literature and trauma, exploring how writing could be a tool for processing and healing. Carlos and I bought a small house on the outskirts of the city with a garden that became my passion. Planting, watching things grow, harvesting. There was something deeply reparative in this cycle, in this connection with the earth and its rhythms. Today, at 73, I look back and see a life that, despite all odds, flourished. Not without scars, not without persistent pains, not without moments of doubt and despair, but a life that mattered, that made a difference, that transformed at least a small corner of the world. Carlos left 3 years ago, a quick and relentless cancer that took him in months. The pain of this loss is different from all others I've experienced. Clean, honest, without complications of guilt or regret. We loved well. We lived well together. We said everything that needed to be said. The longing is intense, but sustainable. I never imagined I would be here, my dears, sharing my story with thousands of people through a YouTube channel. When Joanna, the granddaughter of one of the first women we welcomed at the Women's House, invited me to participate in this project of elderly women's memories, I hesitated. What interest would young people today have in the story of an old woman like me? But she insisted, saying that stories like mine needed to be told, preserved, shared. Grandma Simone, your journey could save lives, she said. And how could I refuse when put that way? If my story touched your heart in some way, I ask that you leave your like, subscribe to Joanna's channel, Grandparents' Tales, and share it with someone who might need to hear that there is life, full, meaningful, even joyful at times, after trauma. Each like, each comment is an encouragement for other women like me to share their experiences, breaking the silence that was imposed on us for so long. In the comments, tell me where you're watching from. It's an immense joy to know that my words reach hearts from all corners of this vast America and beyond. And if you too are a survivor, know that you are not alone, that your story matters, that your scars, however deep they may be, do not define who you are or who you can become. Always remember, we are like those stubborn flowers that sprout in the asphalt. The world may try to bury us, but it doesn't know we are seeds. And seeds, when they find even the smallest crack of light, inevitably bloom.